Hello all. So this is the inaugural video for my YouTube channel. I don't know if you knew you were going to be the first one, Kevin, but
Oh, wow. What an
we're,
honor.
yeah, we're going to be discussing some of his work on social trust, political polarization, democratic deconsolidation, norm erosion. Maybe you could just say a little bit about yourself to start off with.
Sure. Sure. So I'm an associate professor of philosophy here at Bowling Green State University, and I run our program in philosophy, politics, and economics. Most of my research to date has been on the liberal tradition, the case for liberal democratic institutions, how extensively those societies should use the market, what the proper role of religion is in such a society, the extent to which religion should play a role in democratic deliberation, the extent to which it grounds religious exemptions. My work then branched out into questions about the foundation of liberal order itself. And my work over the past 5 years has tried to ground a case for liberal order on the claim that it has the unique capacity to sustain trust between diverse and even potentially polarized perspectives. And the argument's very, very simple: is by trying not to take sides on matters of reasonable dispute, that people can trust one another to abide by shared rules because they're all, at least to some degree, acceptable because the rules aren't sectarian. And so we can convince people with very different points of view that we can be trusted. So that came together in my second and third books, Must Politics Be War, which is very philosophically oriented, and then the book that we'll talk a bit about today, Trust in a Polarized Age, which is the sequel. And it's trying to connect the social scientific literature on trust with the sort of philosophical and normative arguments for liberal order. And so I'm trying to give a kind of comprehensive normative and empirical case for the retention of liberal institutions under conditions of diversity and polarization following trust.
Very good. Some people watching may not know what liberal order refers to.
Yep, very good. So think about it in the following way. You may think that most societies' norms and culture fleshed out very specific paths of life, very specific roles and hierarchies, where most of life was not based on personal decisions. It was based on traditions and hierarchies. A liberal order is one where persons, as Karl Popper said, must make personal decisions. And it is a society that allows people to carve out their own kind of path in life, not that necessarily people always get it right, but that on some grounds of goodness or justice, that this is the best way to go. And the way that that manifests itself is in a couple of different ways. First is principles of liberal order, or that persons are naturally free and equal. That is, no one's born under the natural authority of anybody else save children under parents. And that derived from this are a variety of institutional commitments. For instance, typically there's the liberal state is one that is religiously neutral. It doesn't declare for Catholicism or Protestantism. It doesn't declare for Islam or Judaism or Hinduism. The state is said to be neutral. And liberal theorists have also tried to argue in more recent decades that the state should be neutral even among controversial moral views. But a liberal order also recognizes the fact that as persons are naturally free and equal, there's a great deal we don't know about the world, that we need institutions to make discoveries about how to better live together and to compromise. And so this is where the liberal twin commitments to democracy and the rule of law on the one hand, and the market economy and the welfare state on the other kind of come together. Because really, liberal order is trying to say that we use processes and procedures that are considered fair in order to resolve our disputes. And many people look at, for instance, the rule of law and judicial rights in this way, the equal right to vote and run for office in another way, the right to have at least some degree of private property to participate in the market, not a perfectly free market, but an extensive market, and that there is some kind of guarantee from government that one can use one's powers of deliberation. So the welfare state component of this is important because the extent of the welfare state is something liberals greatly disagree about. But the basic idea here is that people ought to be guaranteed the resources they need to make their freedoms and their choices effective. Right? I mean, if you're starving, your freedom.
You're not going to be very free and equal if you can't even meet your own basic needs, or can meet them by entering into some extremely exploitative relationship with someone who owns capital.
Yeah, that's the idea. And so really, though, all of these institutions flow out of these ideas of natural freedom and equality, and of living the opportunity to live the goodness and justice of being able to live an open life. Not that people can't join or form hierarchies, not that those can't be, those groups have the true view, simply that it is best that the state not prescribe those particular forms of life.
Right. Very good. Very good. And so you're thinking one major argument in favor of the liberal order is that it fosters social trust.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
That's
so
right.
maybe you can explain what social trust is and why it's so important that we foster it.
Good. So the way I think about social trust as a quip is that it is this is not as philosophically satisfying, but it's helpful. The faith that we have that strangers will follow established norms. So the key to social trust is that it's sometimes called generalized trust. It's not trust placed in specific individuals or groups. It's a generic trust in the representative stranger in one society. Some of the best illustrations here are the informal norms of traffic, not the ones that are enforced by the law directly, but the ones that require some kind of discretion and giving on the part of others. So for instance, allowing people to merge into oncoming traffic. I mean, you don't have to do it, right? But you really do have to trust that other people will do it to get along driving. And you also feel that there's an expectation that you ought to let people merge into oncoming traffic, and that you'll be subject to some kind of sanction. I mean, if it's just a honk, if you don't do it, and that most people have internalized the norms. They'll feel at least somewhat bad if they don't allow it, particularly if they end up running someone off the road. But the interesting thing about this is we're trusting people that we don't even see. Right? There's someone they have
you'll never interact with again.
You'll never interact with them again, but you really are trusting them. And it's important also as a feature of trust that it isn't just reliance. It's a kind of reliance. We can rely on our cars. We can rely on our computers. We don't trust them. So there's a key part of social trust is that we see others as morally responsible agents. So that when trust is disappointed or betrayed, we expect an excuse or a justification of some kind. Now, what's important about social trust? Well, it's at the heart of every free transaction we engage in. And as anytime we trade or anytime we ask someone for a favor, they ask us for a favor, trust is invoked. We all have goals that we have to be able to depend on others to follow. And that without trust, those interactions become a lot more fraught and in fact will many times happen a lot less often. Social trust is thought, there's massive empirical literature, mostly survey literature, but some lab work that looks at social trusts in different countries and then looks at certain kinds of indicators of well-being and then looks at correlations and postulates, causal relationships. And there's a big debate in the social trust literature about what's a cause of social trust and what's an effect. But there are a few things that we can say. At least this is kind of my own conclusion about this. One, social trust is both caused by low levels of corruption and helps to bring about low levels of corruption. If we see that ordinary people are engaged, and particularly the police and the judges are seen as like taking bribes, and that a lot of people take, say, policemen and judges to be exemplary members of the community. And so even if they're corrupt, then maybe everyone is. But corruption also, your experience of corruption, say if you observe it in certain situations, that can really decrease social trust. High trust countries like Sweden have almost no corruption at all. In fact, I've worked with a Swedish economist who does a history of Swedish public policy, and it turns out cases of corruption are so rare, like even going back decades in newspapers, that it's just like a huge ordeal if something happens. So there in Sweden, you got about 65% of people saying most can be trusted. That's been steady for 40 years, despite massive policy changes. But if you go to Brazil, where it's like 5%, then of course corruption is everywhere. So you want to reduce corruption. It helps economic growth because people feel like it's making an exchange more. It's easier to build informal institutions like institutions of learning that increase human capital. I am also someone who thinks, although I'm an outlier here, A lot of people think economic inequality reduces social trust because there's a very close correlation between social trust and Gini coefficients, which is a standard measure of economic inequality, as you know, but your viewers may not. And what a lot of people are thinking is, oh, well, there's this sort of difference between rich and poor, and that makes people trust each other less because they're more different from each other. But the trouble is, these are folks who also want to minimize the extent to which ethnic diversity reduces social trust. And in fact, actually, it's the connection there is not as strong as one would think. What really matters is like local ethnic diversity. So, if we add Puerto Rico to the country, we increase ethnic diversity, but it's not going to affect trust in those areas, right? And interracial marriage isn't going to affect it negatively. And actually workplace diversity is good too, because you just interact with people. It's really the issue of having like the African-American bloc, the Irish bloc, the Italian bloc, like that's what's really the Jewish bloc. That's what's really bad for social trust. And so I think something similar about money and inequalities. It's the salient inequalities that bother us. I don't think most people trust other people less because Bill Gates has a lot of money. So what's going on with the correlation between Gini coefficients and social trust? Well, the economists I work with have a really novel view, but it's actually, I think, really plausible, which is that when trust is high, democratic publics demand more redistribution. They demand more redistribution because they think that people won't waste the transfers. We hear, that old urban legend about somebody using their food stamps to buy lobster or something like that. You hear it from so many people, it's never true. But like, these aren't really things that happen in Sweden because they don't have very many means tested welfare state programs rather to their universal programs. So the way Andreas, my economist friend, likes to put it is in Sweden, we redistribute from the top 90% to the bottom 90%. And that means everybody's invested in it working effectively.
Right.
So this is going back to the old adage of the program for the poor is a poor program.
Because even middle class people benefit from free college or these sorts of things. Do they feel?
But really, what it does, it keeps people that are relatively high status and good at managing the system invested in making sure that it works in a timely and effective way. Right. Poor people often lack the resources and the social status in order to for their complaints to really matter, which is sad, but it's just kind of how a lot of societies work. So I think social trust, it reduces corruption, it increases economic growth, it increases economic equality. It does this at the same time, which is awesome because a lot of people think you have to trade them off a lot, but trust helps you not have to do it as much. It's also important, we're seeing, for psychological well-being. When people feel most can't be trusted, that does alienate people and helps them feel isolated. They tend to join associations less. So, Rob Putnam's old work, Bowling Alone, suggested that if you join associations, you become more trusting. Now, most of the literature suggests the reverse. It's high trusters who are high joiners. And so if you have more social trust, you'll have a more robust civil society. So social trust is great stuff, and it's very hard to have too much of it, unless, of course, other people are untrustworthy. But you trust should match trustworthiness, but it's good to have a society that's high in both. Now, there's also political trust in government, and that's more complex. We don't want as much of it because you might think government's kind of disposed.
Government does
work less well. Yes, and the other reason is that we don't expect strangers to pursue certain kinds of benchmarked goals, like some kind of meet some kind of threshold of performance. So for instance, when we trust the EPA, we trust it to protect the environment, right? And so we also judge government institutions by how fair and non-corrupt their procedures are. So it turns out that for trusting institutions, we have kind of two variables that we look at implicitly. One is the input. Is the input good, fair? Did I get input? And the other is output, which is did it do its job to people? Were they effective? And then different societies can weight those things differently, but just about everybody seems to care about both. So those are the two concepts I work with in my work: social trust on the one hand, and political or institutional trust on the other. And political trust is good in a variety of ways. Particularly because I think it facilitates policy responsiveness to certain kinds of problems, right? Because voters will say, look, we trust these politicians, they represent us, they can pay attention to the details and figure it out. And that is sometimes a very nice thing to be able to have, because a lot of the arguments are really complicated, and the whole reason we have representative government is because we're supposed to be able to trust certain people to sort of take a look at the details and think through it the way that we would think through it. If you don't have any political trust, that function falls apart. And so what happens, at least this is my view, with low political trust is that politicians engage in way more pandering and pay way less attention to experts. And they're also less incentivized to cooperate with people with very different positions because they want to be, in highly polarized environments anyway. Now, very high political trust is sort of not the goal. I mean, Swedish political trust is middling. So you don't want to trust government all the time. But you certainly, and this is something I push back with my libertarian friends, you do certainly want to be able to trust government some. As long as it's around, you want it to function effectively. And it's important that countries with relatively high political trust were actually better at effectively deregulating, cutting taxes, and privatizing things compared to the United States. So there's something in high political trust, even for libertarians to love, although that's a hard sell.
Yeah.
I just say don't trust the CIA, but maybe maybe the Social Security Administration.
Yeah. I had two thoughts when you were talking about economic equality. Of course, this is something I know about. One thing was, it seems like there's probably a lot of interesting work to be done on the ways in which, say, distrust along racial lines and economic inequality interact, because specifically thinking about the right wing of the person who's going to blow their welfare check or whatever. I mean, those attacks are extremely racialized in the U.S., right?
In this country, that's
racial
true.
minorities who are,
in this country, that is true. I just don't.
Not everywhere. Not everywhere.
Yeah. Because the Gini coefficient correlations are across a wide range of countries. But I have no doubt that our racial issues make things much worse. I mean, because that is what people have been taught to imagine by certain groups. And it's also simply the case that just as a matter of observation, because of, a history of oppression and a variety of factors, but that's the primary one, you're just more likely to see people using welfare if they're African-American relative to the population. And so, if people already have background racism, then that appearance does represent reality, sort of. It just represents the reality in a different way.
Yeah, because people haven't had the economic
same opportunities. That's right.
Generational wealth or whatever.
That's right.
The other thing, do you think there might be, in terms of the relationship between economic inequality and low social trust, do you think there might be like a kind of almost status anxiety that helps drive that?
I think that my friends have found in one paper that probably about 2/3 is social trust leading to more equality, and 1/3 the rest, although they have a more recent paper that makes it all look one way. But I find a split pretty plausible, because I do think that if you notice extreme inequalities, at least that are in some way close by or that matter to you, for instance, neighborhood proximity, you're like, okay, or the folks in the city, people outside the city are, or you're poor in the rural areas and there are rich people in the city. So for instance, you might think that like rural Californians have less trust because of these kind of very, very rich urban and tech elites. That's very believable to me. I don't think if you pick a random person and then you ask about like very specific people like Gates or Musk or whatever, that it's going to be that way. But if you have the sense that there's a big group, or even a small but sizable group, it's not just a few individuals, I think that can trigger lower social trust. But actually, what I think is going on is that there's some recent evidence that social trust attitudes can change within a single individual, which there's a lot of debate about how much social trust attitudes are fluid once you're an adult, because there's a lot of evidence that it isn't. But there does seem to be an effect from what's called unemployment scarring. So when someone repeatedly tries to get a job and they can't and they give up, that's one thing it does look like can reduce social trust. And what I think is going on is a phenomenon that I haven't written up yet, but that I call social betrayal, where we feel like our society owed us something and failed to come through. So I think this happens a lot with veterans. So there's social betrayal. Someone fights a war like Vietnam and they come back and they're mistreated,
right? Especially
in light of their trauma. But I think it also happens to people that expected dignified work, and weren't able to find it despite sort of following all the rules. And so it might not be the inequality might matter, but it's not the inequality causing it so much as the unemployment, like the deprivation causing it, which leads people to notice the status. So the interesting question would be, like suppose everybody was very wealthy, but inequality was very high. That's a case where I wonder if, there would be much of an effect on social trust. But if people have deprivations, they will resent inequalities more, such that if you level down, you might get more social trust. So no, the relationships can be quite complicated. I mean, the trouble is that we're working with cross-national survey data that is pretty crude because it's really expensive to collect. And so one of my projects now that I'm with Christina Bicchieri at Penn is we're trying to figure out a way to look at the connection underlying cognitive psychology of social trust in a way of figuring out not just how it's learned or transmitted, but maybe more effective and refined ways of measuring it.
Very good. So what exactly is, so we got into talking about social trust because we were talking about it presenting this argument for the liberal order. What is how is it that the liberal order fosters social trust exactly?
Okay, well, so the kind of liberalism that I do and that you were taught in graduate school by your excellence advisor, Paul Weithman, who's like pretty much one of my favorite living political philosophers, is that there's a certain level of moral, metaphysical, and so on disagreement that are just natural to open societies. I mean, if you don't prescribe everything in terms of view for people, even if you try, people just tend to disagree if you allow them to. And there's a lot of reasons for this. Rawls has what he calls the burdens of judgment, where he lists that many of our concepts are vague, that weighing values is difficult. There's a whole variety of sources. Actually, there's a much bigger variety of sources. I just think that in particular, a lot of the problems come from that we agree on a lot of what's good, but we rank them differently. And so once you rank them, and then also we disagree about the mechanisms about how these goods are produced. So once you have different rankings of values and then different views about how they are best realized, then you just get all kinds of disagreement. Even if people, like, by and large, have the same values and want to cooperate with each other, they're just going to end up in totally different places politically. And so the question is, do we take this for granted in political theorizing that there's just going to be a lot of disagreement? Like, is this a parameter? So you could drop the parameter and say, well, suppose everybody agreed, what should we have them do? Right? And that's an interesting question. I don't think it's a terribly helpful question, but it's an interesting one. I'm not sure that the principles we'd identify under conditions of unanimous agreement are as helpful to figuring out what we should do here and now as a lot of political philosophers think. But my case for liberal order begins from the assumption that there's just going to be a lot of diversity. So just to be clear, we're starting off from a society where we're presuming that deep disagreement about the good, about religion, about justice is just a permanent feature of that society. And in such a society, it creates a problem for maintaining trust. And one of the reasons is that we know we're dissimilar from others. We know others have very different values, and we're often subject to a kind of bias that I call the illusion of culpable dissent. So we think the fact that others reject our values or don't prioritize them is evidence of some moral or intellectual fault of theirs and not ours. And I think that our kind of natural tribalism, I think this is exaggerated in some ways, make it hard for us to take other people's perspectives when we know that they come from a very different place. For most of human history, we're trusting people in groups of 50 to 150. And the process of learning to socially trust is we don't really understand how it happened. There's a few interesting theories out there. A lot of it has to do with trade networks. But there's still a question about how we got them off the ground in the first place. How did we stumble on them if we couldn't even engage in social trust? So we have this natural inclination to distrust those who are different. So this creates a problem for social cooperation and for trust. And so we ask this question: how should we organize our institutions in ways that will help people to trust each other? Well, imagine that we have a set of rules that everyone from their own diverse perspective can accept in some sense. That is, the rules on reflection for them compatible with their values. So it's a rule that can be justified to different members of the public, but on their own terms. And this is what we call in the literature the idea of a public justification. But without getting into jargon too much, the thought here is that, well, we can't convince others that we can be trusted just by saying, hey, I share your values, or I'm a member of your family. We have to show it by our allegiance to common rules. And so I can say of you, well, he has different values, but he lets me in traffic. He doesn't steal from me. He doesn't rob. I can see that. I can see that he is a law-abiding citizen, or that he tends to do the right thing. All right. I know that they're a different race. I know they're a different gender. I know they're a different religion, but they're good people, and I can trust them. Okay, so that means that if we want trust between diverse perspectives, society should be organized around mutually acceptable rules. So that's stage one of my argument, is to try to show that if we have rules that can be justified to multiple perspectives, we can overcome diversity and the illusion of culpable dissent and get trust between people with diverse perspectives. Stage two of the argument is, well, what is publicly justified? That is, what rules can be justified to multiple perspectives? And the thought here is that most people may want institutions to embody their own values, but they also know in a diverse society that others won't like that very much. In fact, some others will dislike it so much that they're either simply acquiesce in the threat of violence, in which case you don't really know if they're going to disobey behind the scenes or not. So that creates doubt, right? Or they're just disobey, period. And then you don't even have the order that you want. So if you think about it, the trust between master and slave, right, or between hegemon and the marginalized, the conditions for it are undermined. You need a certain degree of equality. And so the society, it's going to be very important for the state insofar as it can to have what are widely regarded as fair procedures and practices that allow each person to live out their particular set of norms and values, and that the state isn't actively promoting goods that some people entirely reject as goods. And it looks to me, as I argue in my work, that liberal order is really the only order that can do that. And then lo and behold, it turns out basically all high social trust societies are liberal democratic market welfare states. Now, this isn't because I think there's a variety of feedback loops that, cross causal. So in the book, I talk about a lot of the different potential connections. There are some that are really strong, that are clear between, say, corruption and social trust, having fair procedures, particularly the fair parliamentary procedures. People feel like that the people making the rules can be trusted. That really matters. And it also matters that there's a certain degree of economic growth, that everyone that feels like that they are a participant in it. I think a degree of economic equality matters for those on the left. It seems to matter less for people on the right, but you want everyone to be able to trust. So though we didn't find any effect of free speech on social trust, which is a little peculiar. We don't really know why. Same with freedom of the press. We didn't find any correlation. It seems to me if we just had state media immediately, like Trump just made like one election again and made One American News legal channel, right? I mean, like people wouldn't trust anything. Right. Like they would, so I don't know why it didn't show up, but nonetheless, it didn't. So we're just saying what we were able to find. And the overall conclusion is that both in principle, what liberal order does in virtue of being publicly justifiable is it lays the rational grounds. It provides the rational or epistemic foundations for trust by driving people to be trustworthy. Because people say, look, others are abiding with the rules and they expect the same of me. So you follow the rules from your own conviction, right? And that's the epistemic justification for trust, is public trustworthiness. But then the thought is, okay, well, you can provide an epistemic justification for a belief and not have it, right? So do the institutions that justify beliefs also cause them? And Just Trust in a Polarized Age says, maybe. And goes through, I spent years, hundreds of papers on trust. And chapter 2 of Trust in a Polarized Age goes through my whole summary of it. So that's basically the outline of the arguments for the project. And so good. We hit trust and liberal order and their connections and so on. I think, it was good to be able to outline all that. And I think the viewers you're developing will find this of interest, because I think a lot of people that know your work don't really know that you're a jack of all trades. And so they'll know your work as a philosopher of religion, but they may not know of your work in moral and political. So I was pleased to come on just because, you may end up doing a lot of philosophy of religion stuff. But yeah, we're in the throes of philosophy, politics, economics right now, what we call, for those of you who don't know, metaphysicians listening, PPE.
Yeah, very good. And thanks for the kind words.
Yeah, always.
I guess we've been talking about the liberal order fostering social trust. And then there's also this kind of inverse phenomenon we're seeing in a lot of places, where it looks like low social trust is potentially threatening the liberal order.
Yes, that's right.
Leading to democratic deconsolidation, backsliding, the breakdown of the norms that are needed for the liberal order to survive. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that, the relationship to democratic erosion.
I mean, the problem is that the norm eroding countries do not seem to be, social trust is generally very stable in society. We're the only established democracy, that is a democracy that's existed for more than 50 years, where social trust has fallen in a statistically significant way. And we just don't know why. And I think it's our high levels of political polarization. You can get democratic backsliding in countries where social trust remains relatively stable, because the literature that's growing on democratic backsliding is that usually the backsliders started off as completely legitimately elected democratic officials. So Chavez in Venezuela, Erdogan in Turkey, and Orban in Hungary. But what they do is they gradually find ways of converting small victories into large parliamentary majorities. And then they produce new constitutions with new rules empowering people and so on. So it really takes a skillful politician that's in power for a while, because early on, a lot of these folks are just moderates, or they're just solidly left wing, but they're not. And so the interesting patterns of deconsolidation or democratic norm erosion can happen in countries, but none of these countries were ones where there were already especially high trust.
Right.
And so I think what high levels of social trust do is they undermine the conditions under which people are willing to put up with democratic backsliding. Because if you feel like most people can't be trusted, the thought is you want your guy in power, so he has the power and the other people don't. And so if there's backsliding, you say, well, at least it's my guy.
Yeah.
Right.
This is why at least this is going to keep the other people out. Who knows what they'll do.
Exactly. This is why the Conservative Political Action Conference, which is the conference for young conservatives that's existed for decades, they have Reagan out 50 years ago, and now they're having Viktor Orban. And Viktor Orban has done things like ban gender studies in Hungary, chased out Central European University on the grounds it was associated with Soros, and generally has a great deal of control over the media, and has rigged the constitution such that if he wins a small majority, he has basically a supermajority in the legislature. And one of the things he's done with the cultural left is just use violent state power and threats in order to cow them. And a lot of conservatives who feel like they're losing the culture war like Orban, because they want him to do the similar stuff here. I don't think we're going to do, so you might see like I'll get you in trouble with all of your listeners, but I'll just say what I think, which is that the attempts to ban critical race theory, while I think for some people it's a little bit like a kind of a witch hunt, but there are probably some places, some public school classrooms have gotten pretty crazy. I don't doubt that. But I actually think it's a little cynical. There's a little bit of testing the water to see if that works, and then maybe go further.
And then if it works, you can start moving on to other things.
That's right. And so I expect with time, Republican candidates are going to start proposing to tax university endowments, especially the big universities. Now, the thing about this is actually, it's not a bad place to get tax money. Like Harvard's not a good, they'll have like a massive hedge fund. Like they can handle high taxes. And I think university endowments for the richest universities should be treated like, I don't have a problem with it, but the problem is with the reasons, right? They're doing it because they want to reduce the power and influence of the academic left. So I'm expecting these things to happen because I think many people on the right feel like the country's culture has changed very quickly and that it's sort of gotten away from them. And I don't think that these are always unreasonable sentiments, because look, if you think you have reasonable values and people are moving away from them, then you're going to worry, right? And if you think they can't be trusted, like you genuinely think they can't be trusted, then you think, oh well, we have to take serious measures, and maybe we need someone a fighter, right? A fighter who can really solve our problems. This is always a dangerous temptation. I mean, in my next project, I've been studying a lot about fascist movements. I don't think we're going to end up with fascism or anything, but how prominent and widespread and enormous they were in Europe in the early 20th century. And they was engaged in a lot of the same worries about particularly communism, in the sense that the fascists were the ones who could really stomp the communists, and that the liberals weren't willing to do it. And so liberal democracy was seen as an ineffectual way of resisting the communists. Of course, people who joined fascist parties were right to not want to become Bolshevik, right? I mean, that's reasonable, but they were willing to overlook people that they actually thought were pretty good. I mean, people forget all the positive press Hitler got for a long time, before Second World War. I mean, Times Man of the Year, just this kind of stuff. So it's important that the natural.
When I was in Munich, they have Munich was the birthplace of the Nazi Party, and they have a museum. Walk through there, and you see their messaging in the early years. You look at the posters and things, and it's the communists are coming for Bavaria. There had been a Munich Soviet set up after World War I that was quickly crushed, but then they say, the communists want to take over Bavaria. You need people who are strong, who can come in and defeat them, and we're going to do it. And that was a big part of their.
That's right. So you say, look, there's a whole portion of the populace that have these bad ideas and can't be trusted, and they're going to do whatever they can to get into power, and they're going to make us their slaves. In the case of the Bolsheviks, this was true, because I mean, the sad thing is that socialism as a spectrum of movements was so diverse prior to Marx, and even remained very diverse after Marx. But with the Bolshevik Revolution, you had a country that was able to modernize quickly and become militarily powerful, that just fell victim to the Reds. The whites, the Mensheviks easily could have won, but this extremely violent, extremely dictatorial variant of Marxism, which, remember, Marx was an anarchist. Okay. I mean, I don't remind you, but that took over, and it came to represent all socialism. And the truth is, they caused mass starvation when they took over. So, people say, look, I mean, if Hitler's the only one that can keep us from starving, maybe that's the guy to go for. The right response is to double down and say, no, we're gonna go for the person that we think is minimally decent to human beings. But if trust falls, social trust falls in particular, then your rational and affective responses are going to be so raw. It's just very hard not to develop distrusting attitudes. I mean, there's a friend of mine, Nick Suey, who's a graduate student at Fordham right now, and we've been having a conversation about Kahneman's System 1 and System 2 and its relation to trust. So maybe there's System 1 is the faster, more automatic decisions where we use heuristics and biases to make decisions. System 2 allows us to interrupt System 1 to make more reflective, cool judgments, although it's very hard to interrupt System 1 in many cases. And System 2 can get corrupted pretty easily. Debiasing is very difficult. But what happens with trust is maybe a System 2, you think, no, I can trust these people. I know, kind of like intellectually, or like I read a study or something. But then they come up to you and emotionally you just can't handle it. This is very easy to see in the case of trauma. So, if someone's been traumatized and the person who hurt them has reformed, just viscerally, just being around them, it's just not gonna work. I mean, there's some exceptions here, but and I think there's a small version of that with distrust. Even if someone isn't actually harming them, there's a belief that they've been harmed. And so viscerally, they just can't bring themselves to trust the other group. The hope is that you get some kind of exogenous shock that brings people together. And I had hoped that that would be COVID, but it wasn't. We were too polarized to make that a unifying event. A war against, I mean, I think a lot of our high social trust probably came from the Second World War. Actually, there's some evidence to suggest we weren't polling in the 30s or whatever, that it was lower then than it was, say, in the 50s or so on. So,
so some sort of external threat brings people together, because suddenly whatever this external threat is seems scarier to me than my neighbors who have different ideologies. And so
we set it aside. It's the way that Protestants and Catholics learn to bury the hatchet. You know, if you look at the diversity of political movements on the American right, communism allowed them to put aside libertarians to get along with Catholic traditionalists. I mean, people who just thought each other were nuts and awful, but communism was able to focus them. And then, of course, you have strong anti-communists on the left, like Kennedy, you know, the right would sometimes imply there were communists on the left, but it wasn't as common throughout. You know, there's plenty. So the country can kind of unite around the Soviet threat, even if people were big New Dealers or whatever. You saw very little in the Democratic Party's left to suggest that they didn't wanted to do away with Congress. And so, you know, people could say, oh, look, you know, I mean, we disagree about all these things, but we know one thing: the Soviets are not the way to go. And we don't not having many Soviets in the country, it can unite.
Right.
Whereas in a country with lots of them, it would create distrust.
Right.
Yeah. So the worry is that we're experiencing something like a mild version of the same pattern, where it's not fascists that are beating communists. It's something like illiberal Democrats defeating very progressive, the sect of global elites that are very progressive. And that's kind of who the foe is. And I do think there is an interesting dynamic here, because I do think that the morality of the sort of global Western elites is pretty different in lots of ways from the morality of most people, because most people's moralities are informed by a religious tradition, at least indirectly. And so on matters of particularly gender identity and so on, that elites are seen as having this kind of one view. And then you ask the average person in China or India or Russia or any Muslim country what they think, say, about transgender issues or same-sex marriage, and you're going to get an extremely different reaction. And so I do think that to some degree, global leadership has invited its own delegitimization in kind of, without realizing it entirely, insisting on their own values in large corporations, like, for instance, social media and things like this. So I think, so what we really are seeing this kind of dual identity politics, right? There's kind of right and left-wing identity politics, and they're kind of competing with each other. And that's growing out of, in my view, a low trust environment where you retreat into your tribal identity because you think the other side is the enemy, right? And they can't be trusted. Here's the trouble about when people distrust each other: it can lead to untrustworthy behavior. And so you can get a downward spiral. A lot of countries will have a high trust equilibrium, and a lot of them are in a low trust equilibrium, and it's very hard to move in between, from what we can tell. The United States is one of the few going down. Denmark has gone up quite a bit, more than we've gone down, which is weird. We don't know why, but you know, for the most part, it's stable. And I think we're moving, or have moved, from a higher trust equilibrium to a lower trust equilibrium. And the kind of cultural war stuff we see is exacerbated by those low trust conditions, and then the behavior of people under those conditions reinforces that they can't be trusted, right? So you say, oh, look, can the right be trusted not to erode democratic elections, right? And the answer, I think, the only objective answer is, well, less than 5 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, by the right, I mean right-wing politicians, right? Like a lot less. You know, so and definitely than 10 years ago. And so sometimes the mistrust is warranted, right? And this is one of the things that happens with the accusations of folks on the left being intolerant, right? you know, make of those what you will. I think sometimes they land. But that, you know, that's a source of distrust, because the thought is that they're dominating things culturally. They're the hegemon. They set the rules for everybody else. Everyone else is low status. And because they're low status, they can be canceled and deprived of jobs and so on and so forth. So there's, again, that hegemon, high status, low status issue that can create conditions of distrust, particularly when people are seen as punished unfairly. That's really a problem. My friend Ryan Muldoon is one of those brilliant guys I know. He has this really interesting hypothesis that basically, like, Twitter is the worst for this phenomenon because the costs of punishment are zero. And so that we could actually get rid of a lot of the canceling if we just made it like have a small price to socially punish on Twitter. Because basically all of it happens on Twitter, right? It's like you tag the employer or whatever. So, yeah. Or we could just shut Twitter down, which would probably be best. But you know, so yeah, I mean, so there is this dynamic of distrust, or this a lot of the cultural war stuff that we see is, I think, a product of falling trust. And then the attendant rise in groupish thinking in terms of political polarization.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. I mean, it's difficult to reach an accommodation because, you know, for someone like me, a lot of the issues that people are reacting against, same-sex marriage or whatever, you know, do seem to be kind of matters of fundamental justice, where it's very hard to compromise as anything except, you know, what Rawls might have called a modus vivendi. Like you might say, well, in some particular circumstance, we can't push for it yet because it won't work or whatever. Ultimately, you know, this is a matter of justice for gay people or for trans people or whatever, depending on the. And so it's hard to leave, you know, it's hard to make a stable accommodation, because it feels like that is, you know, that for me would require compromising things that have to be non-negotiable, basically.
And I mean, and this is important because there's something about justice that connotes non-compromise, right? This is a matter of fundamental rights, and we can't compromise. Truth is, we do all the time. European countries have compromised on abortion. Yes, there's less disagreement about it, but I mean, you know, we've compromised on salvific religion, where, you know, we could probably do this too. And we can continue to have our justice beliefs, but the question is whether we take the fact that someone has unjust views as a reason that we can't trust them in ordinary day-to-day life.
Sure. Yeah.
And that's the thing that's bad, is all the sorting and all the division and so on that happens socially, and people's obsessive approach to politics in this regard. I mean, because it is certainly true, even though I regard these as matters of basic justice. My family members who I disagree with, you know, I still trust them. They're your family.
Yeah.
And you don't want your family relations undermined. And I feel the same way about citizenship. It's just like, we don't want fellow citizenship destroyed by the fact that we think others have unjust views, because getting justice right is sometimes really difficult. And even when it's easy to get right, they're just clearing out biases is just a very, very hard thing to do. It's a very virtuous thing when it can be accomplished, but it's rare in a way, because so many people take their political beliefs, again, from their political tribe and their elites, and they're the things that seem like obvious, and there's all the pressures that come from kind of Overton window type phenomenon, right? These are the views that are this acceptable range of opinion. If you get outside of it, you might be penalized. You know, my own experience in politics is that every political group I've ever belonged to, I've been an outlier on some issue. And so, like, I'm never at the center of the group, ever. And so I have a lot of experience, like, you're just trying to, well, let's talk about this rather than that, kinds of things, just because, you know, if I'm hanging out with libertarians and my faith comes up, you know, people think it's weird. And if it affects my policy views, then they're really concerned. Whereas, you know, among the Christian philosophers I know, there's actually a pretty broad range of political opinion, but, you know, there is among many the sense that, I mean, really, I mean, Christians can't really lie more. A lot of there are people who think. Now, of course, broader contingent of conservative Christians, I think, are, much as I love markets, uncritical acceptors of it. But not really because they've taken all the econ classes or whatever, right?
Yeah.
It's again this kind of tribal thing. And it's a weirdly tribal thing too. I actually don't think it's going to last, and it wasn't always the case. So, but a lot of it has to do with the way the right is structured and the way it spreads ideas intellectually or whatever. I mean, and I like markets. Okay, just don't get me wrong, but so there's always one of the things that can help to create toleration among people with different views is to focus on the stuff that you do agree on, right? You say, well, wow, we really disagree about abortion, but we're on the same page about immigration, although that's probably false because for some dumb reason we think abortion and immigration views ought to correlate. I mean, there's a case to be made. Nonetheless, you can predict somebody's views on gun control by knowing their view on abortion. Right, yeah. You can predict their views on climate change by knowing their view on universal health care. That's just how polarization is. But there's not necessarily a clear intrinsic connection between those views. So,
yeah. So I wanted to go back to you were talking about the potential for a downward spiral.
Yes.
Once you're in high trust, very hard. And so I want to present to you kind of how things look to a lot of people on the left, including maybe me, though I don't like things looking this way. On the left, you see the Republicans have political power, which is significantly disproportionate to what they would have in like a majoritarian system, right? They've won, I think they've gotten the most votes in one presidential election in my lifetime. And yet, won 2 other elections as a result of the Electoral College. They have 6 seats on the Supreme Court. Probably are going to take both houses of Congress in the midterm, probably are going to win the presidency in 2024. This is partly because of, things built into the constitutional order that advantage rural voters, the Electoral College, the way that the Senate is structured. But this is partly because of norm-breaking actions that they have taken over the way that they've handled Supreme Court and judicial nominations, gerrymandering.
The Scalia issue was a flashpoint.
All sorts of things, and you look and you see, okay, they have kind of a structural bias in their favor. This is partly because of their being willing to break certain norms. It looks like the willingness to break norms is increasing because of Trump breaking norms and getting away with it, because of this growing willingness to not accept the results of elections, just say the Democrats cheated, it was voter fraud. And, you mentioned earlier, you see people like Orban who started out as legitimate, Democratic politicians, politicians who were legitimate by the terms of the the liberal Democratic order, who then managed to leverage their power into a situation where they're just in control for the foreseeable future because they've eliminated, they've turned it into a competitive authoritarian state. And so you see, these moves by state legislatures to try to exercise greater control over the results of elections, et cetera, et cetera. And you think it seems like already Republican power is maybe like to some extent illegitimate. And it seems like there's a real chance that they might expand this in ways that it's no longer going to be possible to undo it in the future, because it will just be too hard for Democrats to win elections and get the sorts of majorities that you need to really take significant actions. They couldn't even pass this voting rights bill. And so then it starts to look like maybe things that are themselves norm breaking, court packing, look a lot more attractive, because you think, look, really, we're just trying to rectify this imbalance that exists because of their norm breaking. And if we don't do this stuff, we might, have a runaway sort of competitive authoritarian scenario. And so maybe you have to break certain norms in order to save such norms as we still have left. And I wonder what you say about that point of view. My guess is that you don't agree that, yeah, the Democrats should try to court pack and that sort of stuff. But
No,
I wonder what you say.
I see the argument because it's a kind of game. There's a game theoretic argument, which is that, well, we're conditional cooperators. And so we'll cooperate as long as the others do. The others are breaking fundamental norms. A lot of this really did get, I mean, Bush v. Gore didn't help, but I think we were kind of past it by 2010 or so, because we focused on other things. And, you know, then I guess it's 2015, Scalia dies. And Obama nominates the now Attorney General Merrick Garland, and he's trying to play that kind of 3D chess with them. These two Republicans saying, look, I'm going to propose a moderate guy that you'll accept because you'll probably lose the election. And when you lose the election, you're going to get a Democrat replacing Scalia, and you don't want to do that. And I think he thought he was super smart. And Mitch McConnell's response was to defect.
Yeah.
We will not seat a Supreme Court justice. And he probably wasn't going to seat a Supreme Court justice unless the Democrats had a majority in the Senate.
Yeah.
And so he couldn't stop it. And he's an extremely skilled politician. I mean, McConnell's one of the great, in terms of effectiveness, politicians in American history. And so he just plugged ahead. And then when Trump won, then they put Gorsuch up. And that was a big change because Garland and Gorsuch ruled pretty differently. And Democrats are really furious about this because it really was a big change. But of course, the Republicans say, well, you know, Robert Bork, that it was the Democrats who politicized the Supreme Court process. I don't know about that. But the problem is that, unlike other countries, our Supreme Court has a huge amount of power. And that it did make a variety of mistakes, in my view, in the 50s and 60s, based on the idea that it had to act to help the federal government to eradicate racism. And so there was a role for a more active Supreme Court to be kind of involved, like Brown v. Board of Education and so on. And they started to extend this to other stuff that seemed similar, like abortion. And taking the most contentious issue of all, about which dispute is actually reasonable, unlike with racism, and making it an issue at the court, created this pro-life movement that did not fully exist. It existed mostly among Catholics. That, and I'll just say this, it created one of those democratic movements in the history of the country. It was a persistent effort to organize and win elections over the course of 50 years that would lead to Supreme Court nominees that would overturn Roe v. Wade in their cases. Of course, in the end, it was affected by the norm violations. And the tragedy of this is that you can learn the wrong lesson. You can say, oh, we played by the rules. But as soon as we broke the rules, we won the conservative legal movement, won its biggest political victory in its entire 50-year history. So it's just like, from the other side, it's like, oh, wow. I mean, the Democrats insisted on this kind of judicial supremacy. We tried to resist this. We didn't succeed. But then, now look, Trump fought the good fight, got Gorsuch on there, fought for Kavanaugh. Ginsburg dies, it gets Barrett in there. Boom, Dobbs. And as someone who thinks that it's just not a good idea to resolve almost any important social dispute by courts. I mean, like, if I were designing a system, I'm not even sure I would have judicial review. And there's a number of political democratic theorists like Jeremy Waldron who've argued similarly. Very few democratic countries have anything like the level of judicial review that we have.
And even your reading of the political effects of Roe v. Wade is quite similar to the one that Ruth Bader Ginsburg had.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people who just thought it was the wrong way to do things. And so part of the issue is the outsized importance of the Supreme Court. My hope is that if we get a stable policy equilibrium where we're dealing with things at the state level, that the Supreme Court will lose importance because abortion is no longer decided by it. I'm not that hopeful, but I think it is one plausible way that things could go. So a lot of what the Democrats are responding to with norm erosion has to do with Supreme Court justices and Supreme Court decisions. And it's very hard to know how to solve that problem outside of comprehensive reform, but I am someone who supports various reforms to the Supreme Court. So 18-year term limits and nominations that are staggered every 2 years, so that every presidential term gets 2 nominations. We know when they're coming ahead of time. There's no surprises. We don't have to worry about random deaths because they're 18-year terms. They're still long terms, so that they're insulated from the democratic process in the way that the founders intended. There's nothing unconstitutional about imposing 18-year terms and setting terms for Supreme Court nominees. I think that is something that can be pushed for. And I think that, before particularly Barrett got on the court, I actually think there are Republicans who would have gone along with it. But now, with the 5 really solid conservatives, you are not gonna see much judicial restraint. I do think Democrats are barking up the wrong tree and talking about Obergefell being overruled. I think the only person who has any real interest in doing that is Thomas. A lot of these issues are going to get resolved that way. So a big part of our problem is we don't have enough democracy. There's too much going on at the level of the courts. And so my hope is that Dobbs will kind of move us away from as much focus on the court, precisely because abortion has been returned to the state.
What do you think about
so I would say to
reform?
Democrats, I would say, the court packing stuff, I think is going to be a real that really is what happens with courts in backsliding countries like Venezuela. Like it's really bad.
Yeah, that's why it seems so bad.
Right. Yes. Yeah. It's just like but on the other hand, it seems like something that should be done. But what Democrats I would recommend focusing on, and this is something that I'm not a Democrat, but I would support, are these kind of common sense, reforms to the Supreme Court. And also, and this is more of a Republican point, but of just doing more stuff at the state level. And what I want to say about this is, of course, for the U.S., I do think we should keep things like the Voting Rights Act intact, that the Supreme Court, I think, is moving away from but I do still think that racial policy has to be handled at the federal level, because I do think remaining culture in the South is such that if you just listen to African Americans talk about this, it's actually African Americans were the only groups that trust the federal government more than most people, which, if you think about it, makes sense.
Makes sense, because the federal government
sort of saved them from most people around them.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So yeah. I think most white Americans, it's like 45% trust most people. With Black Americans, it's like 17%. It's just staggeringly low. Yeah. I guess I'd say the Democrats focus on other Supreme Court reforms, but definitely go for Supreme Court reforms. That certainly needs to happen. With respect to the Senate, I actually think things are a bit more complicated, because it has to do with the voting rules that we have and the fact that parties are competitive firms in an important way. So if we change the voting rules, then we really will change how campaigns work. And it's hard to know what the alternative distribution would be. My issue with the senators, of course, gerrymandering doesn't matter for the Senate. There is no Senate gerrymandering, only for the House. So a lot of people forget this. They're like, oh, gerrymandering.
Well, there's no gerrymandering in the Senate, but there is the problem of very low population
Republicans
states
competing successfully for rural voters. But that is something that Democrats have to get better at, because what they've done is they've moved towards their richer constituents, which are married suburban couples that have been to college. And they've lost their ability to credibly communicate with people at the rural level. This is something that I do think, as much as I disagree with Bernie Sanders, that Bernie Sanders would have been better at, because he was willing to go out and prioritize economic issues rather than a lot of the cultural issues, where many rural people are much more concerned, with a paycheck than they are concerned about how should we refer to Latinos, And I think the best left would be one that somehow balanced these things. But I just think there's just so much. I mean, Piketty, the great left-wing economist who I disagree with about most things, but he has this term that he throws around called the Brahmin left. And these are kind of like the sort of super rich people in like urban left that on the one hand say, oh yeah, we should have all the social democracy. On the other hand, they won't let poor people live anywhere near them.
Yeah.
Right. And those are folks who have a lot of influence and sway in the Democratic Party. And reducing their power and influence, I think, is like pretty much one of the most important things that social democrats should be pushing for internally. I mean, if you've got, a rich, San Francisco person talking about social democracy, and they're also simultaneously fighting tooth and nail against zoning reform that would allow poor people to build dual family homes, you got to call them out. So I think that's one thing that really hurts Democrats' credibility with a lot of rural people, is the sense that their culture is elite and that their concerns are elite.
And they're not. I mean, the Democrats have not spoken. I mean, people who live in some town that the factories have moved away and there's an opioid epidemic, they have very legitimate economic concerns. And when you have the Democratic candidates saying nothing is going to fundamentally change if these sorts of things, then I get that that's not going to be an appealing message. And so I agree. I mean, I was a Bernie person, of course. I agree that the Democrats should be doing things to address the legitimate concerns of rural voters, both politically and because it's the right thing to do. But I do also think, I mean, there are many interest groups that are like, could be outvoted, right? African American.
Yes. That's right. That's right. It's a
and it doesn't seem justifiable to me to think rural voters need to have like their influence systemically inflated to ensure that their interests are taken into account.
I think they're so deflated right now that a little bit of inflation would maybe get to where we.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Maybe.
I mean,
maybe
look,
so.
I'm give me an example. Here's an egregious example. Okay. I'm going to benefit from student loan forgiveness because I've been part of the public service loan forgiveness program. So I'm just being honest with your viewers. So I'm going to personally benefit from this. But I don't need it to be done. It's just going to be done. But massive student loan forgiveness for people that have more than say $10,000 in debt and got their degrees, that will be seen by rural America as like, well, we didn't go to college and we didn't get this debt forgiveness. So why is that? And Elizabeth Warren's like pretty progressive, but she's like howling about forgiving all of it. Now I know what a lot of them want. What a lot of them want is this: you forgive it once, you're gonna have to do it again. You might as well move to free college. So I think that's her long-term game, is to get us to free college. Which, okay, you can talk about this. I think it's a terrible idea because education's a positional good. So it's just the way it works is, you put more in education after a certain margin, and then people have to get even more education to distinguish themselves in the job market. I mean, I think our best, there's a lot of better places to invest funds than in giving people incentives to get more and more degrees. But nonetheless, there are a lot of people that think we should have free college, and I think that's what's going on. But that's just my strategic guess. But I think the immediate term of it is that rural voters are going to be like, I didn't go to college, and these kids are getting what, $10,000, $20,000 knocked off. We'll see if Biden actually goes for it, because I think he knows that it may not be popular with the median voter.
Yeah, I've heard that from people. And I think there is a real problem that comes from the fact that Democratic politicians and certainly staffers and policy people are all, for the most part, highly educated people who have a certain cultural background, are not very attuned to or concerned about the needs of. That's right. All I'm saying is,
I mean, we've been putting a lot of blame on Democrats right now. I just want to make clear that like we could have a similar, if not more intense discussion here about the GOP. It's just to say, you were worried about how things look from a Democrat perspective, and I was just
the reason I'm criticizing the Yeah, like the Republicans are so different from me that, well, there are just all sorts of things I could criticize about them, but like there's almost the narcissism of smaller differences where the people who are supposed to be
Yes,
on your
yeah,
side. But
yeah,
I guess
yeah,
it
yeah,
seems to me that if the solution to that is sort of electorally inflate the power of rural voters, there's
yeah,
no justification for doing that just for rural voters and not for other. I mean,
yes,
Republican
you need
presidential
a,
candidates
yeah,
win with 8% of the black vote, right?
yeah,
They can win basically while, appealing to, only the tiniest fraction of certain very major constituencies,
yeah.
very serious concern. And so I don't see how,
Democrats and
yeah, how it,
Republicans, they're firms, and they have massive
Mhm.
marketing operations and research operations. They can juggle more than one ball. And what Republicans are trying to do right now, which I don't see similar efforts from Democrats, which is very weird to me, which is developing a multiracial rural voting base. Now, I don't know if Republicans will succeed at this, but it's certainly been a lot of talk about what that they wanted to do, because somehow Trump had more votes from Hispanics and from Black Americans than Romney did, which is kind of weird. But he was able to do it. And the thought is that maybe a more focused candidate, that was like DeSantis, would be able to cut in more by doing things like attacking Disney, right? Because African American voters are very culturally conservative, so what I think the Democrats have to do, and a lot of them have thought a lot about this. It's just not very popular right now, which is to have a multi-ethnic program, a policy program that's multi-ethnic for the poor. And so they can handle these things. What they have to do is deflate their richest constituents. Is important, which are very college educated couples, and that's just really hard to do for economic reasons, right? It's because these are the people that are like, oh, I went to school with them and I'm friends with them and my wife's friends with these people and they've called me up and they're asking me for a favor and I don't know if they're going to go away, and so I better do something. I mean, it's that kind of, these are social beings. These are, in fact, politicians are ultra social. They care an enormous amount about what other people think about them, right? Always mollifying people. And so if all the people they know are in this bubble, then you've got all these incentive problems. So yeah, I think that one thing you've seen across much of Europe as well is the decimation of center-left parties. I mean, just think about the UK. The Conservatives have gone through what, like 3 prime ministers, but they've remained in power for 11 years, 12 years now. It's a long time. Merkel, I know she's kind of looking a little worse right now, but I actually think her legacy will persist, because she was the un-Hitler, right? I mean, she kept the peace and growth and compromise and stuff. So you have a lot of center-right parties that are able to kind of like capture the energy of populism to some degree, or even heroically resist it, in my view, as Merkel did with the refugees, Syrian refugee situation. So the center left is just trying to figure out what to do. I mean, I'm just stunned by Labour's weakness in the UK. But yeah, a lot of the center left parties are really getting kicked hard. And so this is a problem that different democracies are going to have to solve in different ways, that the center left is going to make a comeback. But it turns out that cultural conservatism plus economic liberalism can win elections. And that this is one people were saying about the British left, is they were saying it was easier for the right to move left on economics than for the left to move right on social issues. And that's what's enabled a lot of center-right parties to do well, because they move left on economics, they hold fast on the cultural agenda, say moderate sounding stuff. DeSantis won't even say negative stuff about gay marriage today. So, you say, oh, I'm against the crazy left wing stuff and I'm not going to cut your Social Security. And then you can win. So yeah, the center left has to figure out not to be captured by its Brahmin left, by the Brahmin left, by its extremely high status influencers. That you get the cross section of them on Twitter. The kind of Twitter is kind of run by what we, But I'm using Piketty's term. Some people may not like that term. I'm like, okay, if Piketty's using it, I'm probably safe. But it is a dilemma. And I think it's causing geopolitical problems as well, because it's the same group of people that's running social media companies and who are making the rules about what's inbounds and out of bounds for people all over the world. And one of the things that's going on is that these companies kowtow to China.
I think you have to leave in a minute.
Yes, I do.
So maybe we should, if you have a final concluding.
Yeah. I'll turn to it. Okay. So the enduring problem the United States has, in my opinion, is that assuming we want to maintain liberal democratic welfare state capitalism, as I think is our best option for social unity going forward, we need to focus on the relationship between falling trust and polarization, and that we need to start pursuing policies that can restore trust and decrease polarization. There's a whole host of such policies will have to be combined in quite an array, but we haven't been as polarized and distrusting as we were. I mean, just look 20 years ago. Other democracies don't have these problems to the same degree. We can just look at Canada or at Australia, right? We're not doomed, is right, the message. Okay. And that there are reforms like Supreme Court reform, like housing reform, that I think there's reason to think that can help to restore trust and reduce polarization. For instance, we would reduce polarization if the Supreme Court mattered less. That seems very, very clear. And the source of distrust of fighting that come from fights about Supreme Court justices would go away as well. So in general, the message is, look, if we want to preserve the kind of free and open societies that we have, that's something that we value. We have to keep trust high and polarization moderate to low. Actually, because no polarization is also bad because you don't have choices between parties. So that's really where I would have people who will broadly identify as part of the liberal tradition put their focus, some of their energy into thinking, okay, we're reacting from low trust. How do we get more trust? In the meanwhile, maybe we have to play strategically, but the overall goal is the focused restoration, the commitment to restoring some degree of social unity. So that's where I would end things.
All right. Well, very good. Thanks so much. I don't know. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I had a blast.